Whenever David comes to talk, we always get a large group of people, especially residents that want to know more about the history of our little area, the Kekakovik mine, the Paulson mines, or the railroad that went from Port Arthur all the way to the Kekakovik Trail. I guess this fascination, I've always heard about this horseshoe that came from the Paulson mine, and so years and years and years I heard about this. And thankfully we have somebody here too from the Thunder Bay Historical Society. He was a curator. And because a couple years that we've been talking back and forth to get this artifact, I called it a horseshoe. Apparently it was known as a paperweight in their archives. And so I heard about this and just kind of communicated, and we're very, very happy that the Thunder Bay Historical Society has us on loan to the Gunflint Trail Historical Society, at least for a while. And it's just, and that's what David's doing here today. He's going to talk about this artifact and why and how it ever became. So we're very, very fortunate to have him. He's the history teacher up at St. Patrick High School. He's also been researching the railroad since 1994. He's been writing books on it. Unfortunately, we haven't had him speak because of COVID and through the years. So now we're down having him here. So thank you very much for coming. I'm very excited about this. So as you can tell. But we'll let David talk all about it. Thank you for coming.
All right, thanks for the introduction, Bonnie. Let's see if my clicker will cooperate here. So I'll talk a little bit more about myself momentarily here. But obviously you got a little introduction to the very important artifact, and I'll talk a little bit about the story of how this sort of came to be and how this sort of played out, because I was kind of a small little cog in the process. And I'm glad it's made it here. This is my first time seeing it as well. I've never seen it up close. I've seen pictures and images of it, but nothing firsthand. So as Bonnie mentioned in the introduction, so I am down here from Thunder Bay. I've been to Chippewa many times in the past. So as I said to a few people, this is not my first rodeo. Lots of familiar faces and some good friends that I'm catching up with here at the Nature Center here. So again, I am a high school history teacher. I'm going to be starting my 27th year, I think, of teaching. So been around the block a few times. I'm also a high school football coach. I'm kind of winding down my career a bit, kind of handing off the reins as I sort of wind down my teaching career as well. I am a dad. I do have a wonderful wife. Tried to convince her to come here today, but couldn't twist her arm enough. I have a couple of teenage boys, men, I guess you can call them. And they've been with me on a few of my adventures in the past. And so as Bonnie mentioned, I've been doing this for a long time, and so my journey actually started down here in the Boundary Waters. So back in 1990, when I was a teenager, I made my first trip down to North Lake and my first introduction to this railway line that I knew nothing about that ran along the shores of the lake. And kind of piqued my interest a little bit. And in 1994, so it's been 30 years, I actually formally began researching this railway line. At the time, there was no book about it. And I was kind of out of the way down here, because it is a bit of a lengthy drive. So on the way here, I was actually sort of reminiscing and thinking about, come August, I actually did a kind of a very long hike. I basically walked in, because at the time you could not drive into North Lake. I walked in from the access road all the way down to North Lake, and then I got a boat ride to basically the narrows between Little Gunflint and Gunflint. And over the course of 3 days, I basically walked the entire railway line along the north shore of Gunflint Lake, and then walked back out. So yeah, I've been doing this for a long time. I'll mention this towards the end. I'm kind of juggling a bunch of projects right now, one of which hopefully will result in a book about part of the area history here. So a few years ago, I started putting this into my presentations, and oftentimes I get the question, what does a guy from Canada, doing here in Minnesota, talking about, a part of Minnesota history. And even though, we're talking about two separate countries, obviously, a lot of you are from the state here in Minnesota. Obviously, I'm from Ontario, okay, two different countries, a lot of different sort of backstories. But despite those differences, there's a lot of things that bind us together. And one of those things is our shared history. And when we're talking about things like the Paulson Mine and the Port Arthur Duluth and Western Railway, it is something that brings us together. It is a shared piece of history that we're very, very fortunate to have. And it has really kind of, had a huge impact and influence on how, the history of this area is played out, and the relationship between, the province of Ontario and the state of Minnesota and our two countries as well. What I'm going to do today is basically going to be talking about the whole history of the Paulson Mine, which basically spans quite a long period of time. Bonnie mentioned that I haven't been down here for a while, and right before the whole pandemic broke out, I was actually in the process of kind of digging into a part of the history of the Paulson Mine, kind of a more recent, if you want to call it that, because now we're going back 100 years or so, part of the history of the Paulson Mine. I was actually doing that right at the start of the pandemic, but the history of this dates back as far as 1850. So, our first little inkling of something happening, and again, when you talk about this history, not only does it bridge multiple countries, but oftentimes people just think that this is just a piece of history of this particular area of Gunflint. The history is bigger than this, right? Like when you talk about the Paulson Mine, you're also talking about a lot of people that were tied into other parts of the state of Minnesota. Same thing like when we talk about the history of the railway that was built through here is not just a local thing to the area around Thunder Bay. It's much bigger than that, right? So back in 1885, we saw kind of a few things happening in Minneapolis. We saw a bank called the State Bank of Minneapolis being incorporated. And, again, like with a lot of the ventures that are happening at the time, kind of, new bank, kind of what's going on here. What's interesting is we see some really kind of notable names come up, okay? We see a guy by the name of John Paulson, right? Paulson Mine. We see another guy by the name of Christian Courtguard. There's a few other interesting names that are thrown in the mix here. This guy right here. Okay, A.E. Rice ends up eventually becoming lieutenant governor of the state of Minnesota, right? So we're not just talking about sort of, kind of people that are unknown. We're talking about some people that are, pretty affluent within the upper echelons of society in places like Minneapolis. I don't have time to go into all of this guy's backstory. The amount of work it took to piece this guy's life together was an odyssey. John Paulson's a pretty common, when you start doing the research, John Paulson's a pretty common name in a place like Minnesota. I remember getting this, writing away and to the state archives, and basically getting this picture. Going, I don't know if this is John Paulson. This in fact is John Paulson when he enlisted as a volunteer in the Civil War. And again, there's a huge backstory to him, and it would take me another presentation. I've actually done a presentation on John Paulson and his whole life story because it is quite complex. And so some of the other players, Christian Courtguard, again, another kind of very interesting sort of backstory. Again, it would take a long time to sort of explain his whole life. So this leads us from this bank, this leads us into the creation of something called the American Realty Company. And this is going to be really important because this is going to be one of the chief entities that plays a big role in what happens here. So a couple of years after the bank was incorporated, we see this American Realty Company being incorporated in the state of Minnesota. Paulson again, Christian Courtguard. I don't know who this Fred McKinney is. Again, sometimes you can't piece together everybody's life. But the fact of the matter is we have this company that's being created. And why the company is being created is kind of the interesting part. So then that leads us to talking a little bit about this area. So the first mention of any iron in this area, came out in a report by this guy here, Joseph Norwood, back in 1850, right? And so you basically have, as people are, as settlers are moving from the east to the west, there's a lot of settlement that's happening as well as exploration that's happening as well. And so essentially you have prospectors that are crisscrossing the area and they're looking for anything that they can find, right? So they're looking for gold, they're looking for silver, and what's becoming one of the big sort of commodities at the time is iron, right, with the Industrial Revolution. A little while later, some of you guys might be familiar with this guy, kind of a bit of a key character in the development of Grant Moray in the area. So Henry Mayhew, he basically comes along and he confirms what Norwood has discovered and basically says, yes, there is iron in the area. I'm not a geologist. I don't play one on TV either, right? One of the things when you do a lot of historical research, there's a lot of hats that you have to wear. And sometimes it can be overwhelming. So basically what we know geologically speaking is the Gunflint Range, okay, which extends way up here, okay? My cabin on the lake is up here, and basically the Gunflint Range extends way up there, okay? It's all one huge iron range. Basically, geologists know that it's the Gunflint Range and the Mesabi Range are one range, and way back in geological history, they were separated by the intrusion of this Duluth complex that basically separated the two iron ranges, right? So, what you see happening on the Mesabi Range is what potentially could happen in the future on the Gunflint Range. Maybe not necessarily here, but particularly north of the border. So this little document here basically kind of chronicles the history of kind of what happened. It starts talking about the Gunflint Range going back to 1878. In 1886, there was an effort that was made. It talks about Henry Mayhew, it talks about Paulson, talks about a couple of other guys, and then it kind of sort of talks a little bit about what sort of played out. I wanted to show you this because it kind of talks a little bit about the early history of sort of what happened. So this is where we have to bring in the sort of the other part of this story, right? Because you cannot talk about the history of the Paulson mine, by itself. You have to talk about the history of the railway line that was built here to here. And so this is where the Port Arthur, Duluth, and Western Railway comes in. Again, this is a whole nother topic that could take up hours to explain. I'll give you the short version. So essentially, you have this community that's being established on the Canadian side of the end of Lake Superior, eventually becoming the communities of Fort William and Port Arthur, now Thunder Bay. Basically, they are looking to expand. They're looking for connections. Ideally, they were trying to go south, okay? And again, I'm not going to get into all the politics of all this, but basically, they're not allowed to go south, and that's a whole other story that ties in with the building of the Canadian Pacific Railway. So they said, well, we're going to go west. We're going to build our own railway line. So they're looking to go into the Rainy River area, right? And so in 1883, we see the incorporation of the Thunder Bay Colonization Railway, right? And so this is sort of the precursor to the railway line. Nothing really comes of it. Basically, there's no money to build it. Eventually, what ends up happening is in 1887, the name of the line is changed to the Port Arthur, Duluth, and Western, basically receives approval from the Canadian government to build. And in particular, there's a change in the route. So the Thunder Bay Colonization Railway was supposed to go west. All of a sudden now there's a change in the railway line going to the southwest. And all of a sudden you start hearing the place Gunflint Lake. Now, I've never been able to piece together exactly what has happened. The only thing that I've ever found is, and it's very circumstantial, okay, I'm not a lawyer, but I would know, I wouldn't take this to court. The Winchell brothers, who basically wrote the geology of Minnesota, were actually in the late I think around 1888 or so, 1889, they actually did, they were part of a meeting, and I can't even remember what it was. It was a scientific society, and they were meeting in Toronto. And the Winchills were there, and some of the players that eventually led to the building of this railway were there. And so it's very convoluted, and it's not particularly clear how this all kind of played out, but somehow or another, right, the railway's direction gets changed to being built down towards Gunflint Lake. This is an early map, 1887. Doesn't show the complete route, but basically shows the railway line coming from Port Arthur, working its way in a southwesterly direction, right? Here's the boundary down here. Here's Arrow Lake, and North Lake and Gunflint Lake would be over on this side over here. So after a couple of sort of false starts, finally in the summer of 1889, construction starts on the railway. Everybody's kind of excited, finally getting this railway built. It's taken forever, right? And, you know, again, people are looking at this as a great opportunity. There's iron down by the border that we're going to get to, and hopefully we're going to get this railway linked to Duluth, and it's going to open up more opportunities for us. Again, this is a whole nother story. I'm skipping out big parts of the story, otherwise we'll be here all afternoon. But basically, over the course of 3 years, the railway gets constructed more or less from what is now Thunder Bay down to the border. Now, as they're approaching the border, they've got to go through all of the hoops, right? Because now they're going to be crossing the border into another country, right? And so they've got permission to build in Ontario. They need permission to build in Minnesota. So they have to incorporate a new railway line. And so basically they incorporate what becomes known as the Port Arthur, Duluth and Western Railway of Minnesota. The people that are behind this are amongst, a name that you guys wouldn't be familiar with, but for those of us who live in Thunder Bay, James Conmee, who's like one of the big heavyweights in the history of our area. And then you see some other familiar names. You see John Paulson, okay? You see a few other names that I'm going to talk about very, very briefly here in a second. Okay, so some of the other names that start popping up are again some of the most affluent people in the city of Minneapolis at the time. So you have people like Lewis Reed, who's a very prominent lawyer. Freeman P. Lane, another very prominent lawyer. Matthew Walsh, a very prominent businessman, right? So again, we're not just talking about just, you know, few cast-off people. We're talking about some of the heavyweights of Minneapolis society at the time, right? And these are the people that are throwing their money and throwing their weight behind this endeavor. Okay, so basically by October, okay, the railway is nearing completion. And now they've actually moved across the border, so construction has commenced over here on the Minnesota part of the line. Everybody's kind of getting excited, and they're also signing contracts, right? Contracts are being signed for the shipment of the ore from the Paulson mine. So speaking of which, let's talk a little bit more about the Paulson mine. Okay, so in order to mine all of this iron that's in the area, we actually need an entity to do that. And so in the spring of 1892, just before the railway line was incorporated in Minnesota, the Gunflint Lake Iron Company is incorporated. And again, you see a cast of familiar people. You see John Paulson, Courtguard, and kind of, again, sometimes you get this odd person that's kind of thrown in there, a guy by the name of Orrin Kitty. Okay, again, kind of a sort of interesting story. The only real kind of claim to fame that Kitty has today is, I don't know if you're familiar with it, I had to look it up on a map at the time when I was doing it, but basically Kitty Kitty has a town, a little community named after him on the Iron Range. I can't remember exactly where it is, but somewhere kind of northwest of Duluth. So basically this company is incorporated and they own property in Township 65, Range 4 West. And basically the line is being built there. It's great quality iron. Everybody's getting excited for this line to be built. There's a picture of Kinney, like I said. After everything kind of fell apart, he kind of was the one that kind of sort of floated to the top. I'll talk about what happened to some of the other players, but again, he went on to found the community of Kinney. One of the interesting things that's turned up, and one of the great things about what's happened in recent years with digitization, so a lot of documents now have turned up on, we have historical societies and archives and things like scanning documents. And so you actually get sort of handwritten notes. This is a handwritten note by a guy by the name of U.S. Grant. Grant actually did the geological survey for this area for the geology of Minnesota. Right, and as you can see, it's dated September the 28th, 1892. He's basically talking about the land that is being owned by the Gunfoot Lake Iron Company. And so he mentions not only people like Paulson and Kortgart and Kinney, but he also talks about who owns the lands that they're going to mine. So you see things like the American Realty Company, which was owned by Paulson and Kortgart, right? You see some of these other people like Millar, Barker, some of the names that came up, Nick Probeck. If you read Willis's Raft history of Cook County, he's featured prominently in there. He was quite the prominent individual at the time, and he had a place on the eastern end of Gunfoot Lake. Again, whole sort of backstory to him as well that we don't have time to dig into. So around that time, basically, after, again, the digitization of all these things, you turn up all this kind of really neat information. So I turned this up digging into the backstory of John Paulson. And so he was sort of this mysterious figure. Like, nobody really knew about him. So speaking of Raft's history of Cook County, like when he wrote the book, at the time, nobody knew anything about John Paulson. He was just kind of this shadowy figure. Like some people have even suggested that he may have not even existed, right? Because just nobody knew anything about the guy, right? Well, you get stuff like this and it talks about him, right? It talks about that, he was involved in iron exploration in other places in Wisconsin, right? And, prior to being involved down here at Gunfoot. And then it talks about, this is one of my favorite lines ever for researching something. It talks about, during the excitement in the South. So that's a nice way of saying, yeah, during the Civil War, right? The excitement in the South, right? And so basically he was involved with some ventures in Georgia and Alabama. So you got a guy that was kind of involved in a lot of things. And even the research that I've done, I don't think I've found everything that this guy was kind of involved with. And he basically talks about, how there's a lot of excitement, there's a lot of great things to kind of open up in this area. So in the summer of 1892, there's an agreement that's signed between the Gunfoot Lake Iron Company and the railway line. And so essentially the railway is going to haul 100,000 tons of iron every year for the next 10 years. Okay, so that's the vision. Now this is key, this is really important because they only have enough money to build the railway line to the mine. There's 40 miles between here and Ely. And so what they need that revenue from the mine to build those 40 miles because at the time the Duluth and Iron Range Railway, which later became the Duluth and Mesabi and Iron Range, and I don't even know what it's called now with the CN, or with the Mesabi subdivision, whatever it's called. So it ended at Ely. They did a survey in 1888 and they went, nope, not building a railway line between Ely and Gunfoot because the terrain was terrible. Right? And even we know building just this 6-mile stretch from the border to the Paulson mine was ridiculously expensive, right? And again, if you've been on the Narrows Road, if you've been on the Centennial Trail, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? It's not particularly easy. So at this time this is all going on, we start seeing things happening, right? So the newspapers here talking about machinery is now being shipped up here, being sent over the railway to the mine site. Okay, the shafts are going in, buildings are being constructed, right? I mean, there's a lot of excitement, there's a lot of enthusiasm for everything that's going to happen. And again, as we wind down towards the end of 1892, 150 men at work, right? So there's a lot of stuff that's going on. And again, when you take a look at the geography of the area, right? I mean, again, you can kind of get an understanding why it was so difficult to build the railway through here. But again, even just plainly speaking, it's not a particularly easy area to sort of get through. So again, the railway's crossing right up here, right? Coming down this way, I'm going to show you a map after, but basically the iron deposits are all in this area here, right? And again, if you've been down the Centennial Trail, right, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you ever have a chance, if you want some light reading, you could read the Geology of Minnesota, as written by U.S. Grant, published in 1899. And so this is the diagrams that show up in the book. And so what we have is, you can see the railway line coming across here. It switches back. There's lots of switchbacks on the line because of the elevation issues, right? A switchback, and then so if you're hiking the Centennial Trail, so the Centennial Trail basically runs on this ridge right here. The Keck is right here, right? So the Paulson Mine is right in between. There's a little lake here, and if you're on the Keck and you look on the other side of that lake, you can actually see the tailings from the mines. You see all these red rusty rocks, right? So there's the Paulson shaft right there, okay? And then there was also explorations going on what is today known as Mine Lake, but at the time was known as Ackley Lake. Now, thanks to the wonders of the internet, these are Grant's actual sketches, right? So I found these, I can't even remember where these came from. Somebody published them, put them on there. Obviously, I know there's some work that's been done through the Grand Marais Museum as well, probably here as well, stuff through the Minnesota Historical Society, digitizing things. So these are his actual sketches, right? So if you go back to that map, right, and then you look at the sketch, right? So this is the sketch that he would have drawn in the summer and the fall of 1892. Basically showing the areas, the explorations, right? And so this is like that was the draft. This is kind of like the good copy, right? And again, you can see that lake here. There's the Paulson shaft, right? There's the railway line, okay? And there's the wagon road that's coming in. You show some test pits and things like that, right? Here's Ackley Lake, which he's described as Chub Lake on here, right? You can see there's another shaft here. So again, if you've been through the area, you know exactly what I'm looking at. So this pit is right beside the Keck, and this is the one for years and years and years. Some of you know what I'm talking about. Had the sign on it that said Paulson Mine 1893, right? That's not the Paulson Mine. We know that's one of these test pit shafts, right? But as far as I know from talking to people, that the Forest Service didn't want people kind of wandering around through the woods looking for the Paulson shaft, right? Didn't want people falling into these shafts and things like that. So it was just very easy to put up a sign and say, this is the Paulson Mine, end of story, right? I can't remember, some of these test pits are pretty deep. I think this one here is good 25, 30 feet deep. You can see all the tailings on the side of the shaft, right? You can see all the red sort of rusty rocks. This is another one of the test pits. This is on the north side of the Keck. This is the shaft on Ackley or Mine Lake, so this is the one furthest to the west. I don't know what it looks like now. I used the 2010 picture because when I went there in 2014, there was so much vegetation growing up in here that you couldn't see anything anymore, right, after the blowdown and the fire. And this is the actual Paulson shaft. So this is, last time I was there was in 2012. I actually, on that visit, I actually was playing tour guide because Eleanor Barr, so Eleanor was a historian in Thunder Bay, and so I had done all this research on the railway. She had eventually written a book on the railway, and she's like, I want to see the Paulson Mine, right? And so at the time, Eleanor was in her 70s, I guess, and so I took my oldest son with me, and I think so 2012, my oldest son would have been 7, right? And another gentleman, another historian, Harold Allenan. So we were kind of this sort of motley crew, hiking along the Centennial Trail, and then you have to kind of get off the trail, and so I had to bring her to show her the Paulson shaft, and she wanted to see it. And again, so this is what you would see when you're looking from the Keck south on that lake, on the south shore of that lake. You see all these red rusty rocks. So basically, by the end of 1892, the railway's been built. Everybody's excited, right? All this optimism. In early January, there's this big excursion that runs from Port Arthur to go see the mine, right? And along the way, there's a bunch of things that happen, right? So they go see the mine, right? And they're amazed at all the work. Paulson meets them at the mine, shows them all the things that's happening. On the way back, they stop on the Canadian side of Gunflint. And some of you know where I'm talking about. So just across the lake, there's this beautiful little beach, right? They decide that that is going to be the town site for the Canadian terminus of the railway. And so they're thinking about names, and they're like, well, why don't we use the names of two of the big Toronto backers of this line, Hugh Blaine and Arthur Lee. So we're going to call this place Lee Blaine, right? And again, some of you may have visited Lee Blaine before. I know I've been there a bunch of years ago with Bruce, and Sue took me for a little tour and showed me a few things that I hadn't been aware of on the site. One of the big issues that we have in this area is, that we know of, there's very, very few photographs. There's only 2 photographs that I am aware of the bridge that crossed from the Ontario side to the Minnesota side. This one was taken in 1911 when they were doing the boundary survey. And there's another one that John and I have talked about that we're aware of that was taken at a different time. It was taken in the winter. And you can see that it's a completely different, and I think it predates this 1911 picture. So here's a map of the railway line, and so basically you can see it crossing into the United States. There was a customs house right here, right close to the Narrows. There was a Y, so basically a turnaround here. I've never been able to find it. One day when I have some time, I have to come back and do a little bit more digging. And then you can basically see the route of the railway. Again, there were several switchbacks because, again, the differences in elevation, and they had to climb quite a bit to get up to the mine. And again, you can see the Paulson mine site on the south side of that small little lake. So just a little bit of a close-up for you. Okay, so, railway's built, everybody's excited, stuff's starting to make the news, right? New York Times, right? Talking about all this stuff that's happening, right? The excitement is building. As we're going to see, there's problems festering, right? Now, I mentioned the little city that was christened on the Ontario side of Gunflint Lake. Well, if we're going to have this big mine, obviously we need a place for all the workers and such to live at. And so essentially, we see the development of a town site very, very close to the mine. And eventually, the name for this town site becomes known as Gunflint City. And again, there's no photographs that exist. There is the only thing that I've ever seen that might sort of try to replicate what it looks like was the artist Howard Sievertson, in one of his books, did a painting of Gunflint City. And so Bill Raff took him to the site, and based on what he saw, he drew this image or painted this image that he thought was, a representation of what it looked like. This is a map that was published by the American Realty Company. There's that company again, talking about Gunflint City, and basically that it's going to be this little sort of metropolis popping up here in, the northern part of Minnesota, and it talks about all the iron that's in the area and how the railway's been built to this area. And so there's a map, and so you can see the railway line coming, and there's Gunflint City right there in section 28. And what it also does is it shows you kind of a tentative route for the railway line here. And it's kind of hard to see on this map here, but all these little dark shaded areas are all pieces of land that are owned by the American Realty Company, right? So again, there's all these little things that are kind of going on in the background here. Now, one of the more interesting part of the history of the Paulson mine is this little sort of tidbit, and some of you are aware of this story already. So at the time that the railway was being completed, and they were working on this little town site, a little newspaper article pops up and it talks about the Hotel de Marguerite, right? It's like, the hotel, right? And it's like, it's kind of very vague, right? And then, it talks again about the Hotel Marguerite being finished, right? It's like, what's the story about? Well, Marguerite is named after this woman. Her name was Margaret Matthews. Everybody called her Mag. She was quite the character. Again, another story that I couldn't talk about, and there could need a whole thing to talk about. Very interesting backstory to her. She built this hotel. She was actually, according to Bill Ruff's book, she was the first woman, I think, that was ever granted a liquor license in the state of Minnesota. These presentations are family friendly, so I won't really delve too much into what Margaret was involved with, but I think probably a lot of you could piece this together. So you kind of have this mining site, you have all these guys working at a mine, and sometimes there's a little entertainment that's needed. So she was very famous for this as well in Thunder Bay as well, right? So she just wasn't operating here in the Gunflint area as well. So basically, the site of Gunflint City was on the northeast shore of this little lake here. So again, if you're on the Centennial Trail and you're walking along that ridge, right, and you look to the south and you'll see that lake, and in the northeast corner of that, you will basically see the site for Gunflint City. So again, this is U.S. Grant's notes, and basically he's talking in here, he's talking about the campsite, basically where it is. And so I'm down on the railway grade, but if you can imagine yourself kind of up on the top of the Centennial Trail, and this is what you're looking at, that's where Gunflint City would have been, on that sort of hillside. So this is a photograph I took in 1998. You could actually see some of the remains of some of the buildings. These are photographs that were provided to me by the Forest Service, and so these are probably taken in the 1970s. And again, some of you are quite familiar. Some of you probably were in there back in the 70s when some of the buildings were, or before, when some of the buildings were still up, and you can see some of the timbers and the remains of the buildings. There was some archaeological work that was done, and these were some of the objects that were located, right? So you basically have some stemware here, right? So again, a little bit more refined than you think it would be. Bottles, and probably the most interesting object, which ties in with what we talked about a few minutes ago, the sole of a shoe. Now, the picture doesn't really illustrate the size, but when you actually look at the shoe, it was apparently very small. And so they're like, there's no way, based on the style of the shoe and the size of the shoe, that that's a man's shoe, right? They're like, that's a woman's shoe, right? Again, draw your own conclusion. All right, so again, all of this great stuff is happening, and then it all falls apart. So in June of 1893, the railway line is officially opened, right? And you can see trains running from Port Arthur down to Gunflint. Now, were they running into Minnesota? As far as we know, no, because there's no reason for them to do that. They are basically getting to the end of Gunflint. As I mentioned, there was a turning Y just across the border. So they may have come to the turning Y to reverse and then come back, but realistically, there's no reason for them to go to the mine unless they're actually hauling stuff out of the mine. Now, we start to see problems start to pop up, and so we start seeing some inklings of this in early May of 1893, talking about a potential sort of world sort of slowdown, right? And eventually this culminates in an economic depression, which becomes known as the Panic of 1893. This has massive repercussions on both the railway and the mining operation, right? And so what ends up happening in the panic, people start rushing to the bank to take their money out of not just the State Bank of Minneapolis, right? But other banks, right? Because people are worried about their money. And the withdrawals are particularly heavy at the state bank, so much so that the newspapers report that Courtguard, who at the time is the president of the bank, prostrated him, right? So basically he's like paralyzed, like he's bedridden, right, by what's happening. Okay? Within a month, all of a sudden now, the American Realty Company is in receivership. Okay? So everything is starting to fall apart. Okay? By the end of August, basically, the company is now just completely insolvent, right? Its assets are being sort of sold off to creditors, right? You know, because there's money that they owe to people. The same thing with the Gunflint Lake Iron Company. So again, we don't know exactly what happened, but we think that there was a lot of sketchy things that was going on. The logical understanding was that Courtguard and Paulson were taking money from the bank and using it for the iron company and the land company to buy up land and to finance this, with the thought in their mind, once everything booms, we'll just quietly put all the money back. Sure. Well, once everybody starts withdrawing their money from the bank because of the panic, everything implodes, right? And so this is where the wheels come off. Now, with the background to all of this, this brings us to our nice little artifact, right? So, at the end of August, there's a very big event happening in the Canadian Lakehead, in what is now Thunder Bay. The Premier is visiting, okay? So it'd be like the Governor of Minnesota coming, okay? So the Premier, Sir Oliver Mowat, is visiting. And so what they decide to do is they want to show him all these great things that are happening on. So they stick him on a train, and they run him to Whitefish Lake. Okay, Whitefish Lake is about halfway down the railway line. He is met there by a train coming from the other direction, okay? And on that train is a flat car. On the flat car is rock that has been taken from the Paulson mine. So, that is what was the end result of all. It's hard to see what is exactly on that flat car, how much rock is actually on there, how much iron is on there, but that is the end result of that. Okay, so they took that back, that rock back, they took this very famous photograph, took this back to Port Arthur, and they had the Woodside Foundry smelt it down, and this is what they got out of it. And maybe at this time I should talk a little bit about the story to all of this. So what ended up happening was, I guess last year at some point, Bonnie and Michael Dujon, who's the curator of Thunder Bay Museum, who's hanging out at the back there, they had been going back and forth about this horseshoe. And they couldn't figure it out because Bonnie, I guess, was going, we're looking for this horseshoe. Michael's like, well, I don't know, we don't have a horseshoe in our collection. And so then I get brought into the conversation, right? And it's like, well, what do you know? So I kind of did a little bit of digging, and I was like, well, according to the records, it says it's a pen holder. And as soon as, you know, within like, I don't know if it was in the day even ended, there's an email that comes back from Michael, yeah, we found it, right? So, because it was termed as a paperweight or a pen holder or whatever it was, so sure enough, this thing turns out, and again, if you have an opportunity to take a look at it, it basically says to commemorate the visit of Sir Oliver Mowat, right? And again, you have this nice, so that is, I'm going to finish the story here, but basically, that is the only thing that actually was produced physically from anything from the Paulson mine. Now, there was other material that was taken from the mine. So remember, this is all going on at the same time. Everything is imploding over here, right? So again, it's funny how we think oftentimes, and I always tell my students this, that sometimes we kind of get into this mindset that everything that happens today, we've never done this before. The spin that was going on, right? Like they're trying to make this seem like all of this great stuff is happening. In the meantime, everything's, like I said, going down the toilet, right? Okay, so fast forward to November, all of a sudden, Courtguard gets arrested, okay? He gets arrested for embezzlement, okay? And so obviously everything sort of catches up to them. So Courtguard ends up going to jail for a couple of years, I don't know, you go on stuff like Ancestry, you find him he's a janitor in Hoboken, New Jersey, right? Like in the 1920s and 30s, right? Like, so just up here and all of a sudden down here. Paulson bounces around all over the place. He ends up in Oklahoma. Sadly, like literally around the same time frame that this is all happening, his daughter passes away. And then his wife ends up passing away. And then he ends up in California, and then he's in Oregon. And then eventually he ends up back in Minnesota. And so I think he was, his family was originally from the Wilmar area, and I think that's where he ends up sort of towards, and he dies in 1914, right? And so again, all of these great aspirations and everything just sort of comes crashing down on them. You know? Technology is great when it works. Okay, so by basically 1896, they're selling off all of the chunks of land. There's Lewis A. Reed again, one of the guys that was one of the promoters of the railway line in Minnesota, right? Again, just talking about how the lines are all being sold off, right? So this is still going on 3 years later. This is one of my favorite stories from this all as well. So I guess when everything fell apart, everything was just left. And I know some of you who've been in the area for a long time have been to places like the Paulson Mine or the shaft that's over on Ackley Lake. And especially at Ackley Lake, there was a lot of stuff that was left. Like I know I'm thinking of Bruce because I had a great opportunity to talk to his mom, to talk to Justine back in the late 90s. And I remember her writing articles about, you know, all the stuff that was left behind. Like they just sort of left it. Well, one of the things that they left was apparently 71 boxes of dynamite. And so some guy decided, so this is like 2 years later, right? So some guy finds out about this, right? Gets his way over here, and I guess there was a bit of work that he had to do because we know that there were fires in the area and some of the wooden trestles had been burned. So somehow or another, he got these 71 boxes across those trestles, right? Because the rails were just sort of left hanging, right? Got them on a train, got them shipped up to Port Arthur, right? Like 71 boxes of dynamite, that's some pretty heavy explosives here. And thankfully, the customs people found out and basically were on him like a hawk and basically seized all of this dynamite. But again, you know, like I said, 2 years later, you know, people are still pulling stuff out of the mine site. Okay, this is where we're going to pick up. We got about 15 minutes left, and we'll finish up the last few parts of the presentation here. So at the same time this is all happening, there's other things that are going on. And so one of the things that they found that was in the area was the original surveys turned up nickel as well. And so around 1895, 1896, they start talking about, you know, the nickel that's in the area, and people start trying to, you know, well, the iron didn't work out, well, let's work on the nickel, right? And so there's a lot of talk, there's a lot of discussions. You go back to U.S. Grant's original notes, and he basically talks about some of the testing, sorry, brain fart there. The testing that was done on the rock, they have said that some of the testings produced 87% nickel, right? So some really high quality nickel in the area, right? And again, you start seeing this talking about it, right? Because it, you know, deals with the railway again, and people are like, well, if the iron failed, maybe we can get the nickel going, right? And so there's a talk about it for a few years, and then all of a sudden, nothing. Right? It just sort of fizzles once again. The only thing that comes out of this is people actually start taking a look at some of the rock that's in the area, right? So we talked about how, you know, that horseshoe was made, but that wasn't the only rock that was taken out of the Paulson mine. So there were actually several train loads of rock that were taken from, I'm guessing, the mines, and I'm guessing these were like tailings or there were spoils from the mines. And basically people were looking to make money, and they said, hey, you know, anybody want to buy this rock, right? And so several train loads of it were sold for construction projects in Thunder Bay, and a bunch of these a bunch of these carloads ended up, I think in this one case it talks about building a grain elevator, and they were using the foundation of building a grain elevator. Right? So there's several articles talking about it. Okay, so fast forward a few more years, things start popping up again. Right, and so again, there's around 1900, there's talk about reopening the mine, right? There's people down here, they're moving some supplies down there as well, right? They're talking about, the fact that this is going to be beneficial for the railway. By this point, the railway has gone completely bankrupt, has been bought up by another company, right? So essentially, the failure of the mine killed the railway. Okay, so the two entities are tied to each other. And so again, you see these newspaper articles, and they're talking about work being done and people being shipped down here to Gunflint along the railway line, and they're bringing in equipment and they're doing all this work, right? And again, there's some optimism about what this could potentially lead to, and we're talking about even guys going on strike because they want more money, and it all just tanks, right? For whatever reason, it just doesn't play out. A couple of interesting things on this map. So this is a Cook County map, and it basically shows who owns the land. The railway line on the map is terrible, right? Because it's not anywhere close to what it shows. But there's a couple of really interesting things on here. For example, there's a chunk of land there that's owned by the Duluth and Iron Range Railway, right? And in my research, I'm on the National Archives in Canada. It's called Library and Archives Canada. Come across this document, and it says Gunflint Lake Railway Map. And I'm like, there's a map of the thing, right? So I write them. They're like, sure, we'll copy this for you. So they send it to me, and all it is a bunch of letters. And it's letters from the Duluth and Iron Range Railroad asking if they have maps of the area. Because Duluth and Iron Range, again, is looking at potentially building an extension from Ely up to Gunflint. Never gets built, right? But I found it really interesting that they own a little sort of chunk of land in there. So, maybe even they had aspirations of doing some iron mining in the area. Okay, so I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, I'd been doing some work on this right when the pandemic started, and I was kind of sort of digging into this. So there's this little glimmer of hope that pops up again in the early 1920s. This is actually written about in Raff's book, and I kind of took some stuff from him, and then there was some stuff that I was able to dig up on my own. So, all of a sudden you start hearing some stuff about people kind of coming up to Grand Marais, and people from Chicago, right? And, that there's a lot of detail mentioning that they're Polish, and I don't know why they had to emphasize that, but it's part of the story, right? And so all of a sudden you start seeing some things happening in Thunder Bay as well, right? So basically there's a blast furnace that all of a sudden they're talking about it's going to be sold. And it's going to be sold to kind of, these unknown sort of investors, right? And then there's talk about repairing the railway, because by 1921, the railway's only running as far as North Lake, okay? Because what's basically happened is, again, everything from the border to the Paulson mine, again, there were several trestles that were burnt. The railway stopped running to Gunflint in 1901. There was a brief little resurrection in 1902 that ties in with some logging that was happening on the east end of the lake. That's a different presentation. And that ties in with the book that I'm working on. But basically after that, there's no trains running to the end of Gunflint. They're only running as far as North Lake Station, right? So now they're talking about sort of, redoing the railway line. They've got some stuff to fix up. If you've been to North Lake before, you know that there is a 1,000-foot trestle on North Lake that was burned in 1909. So that is gone. That needs to be replaced. So there's some stuff that's happening, right? And again, there's some people are visiting, people are talking about, but everybody's kind of tight-lipped, right? Nobody's saying what's going on, what's happening, right? And so then finally, after a little while, all of a sudden it's like, there's a plan, right? A Chicago company has basically made a deal. By this point, the railway is now owned by CN, right? They made a deal with CN, and basically they are going to rehabilitate the railway line, and they're going to rebuild everything all the way to the Paulson mine. Okay? And so they've got about 21 miles of railway line that they need to rebuild. And so the company is known as the Palatine Mining and Development Company. Okay? And so this is the blast furnace that they were looking at purchasing in Port Arthur. Right? And then again, there's all of these discussions that are sort of going on and happening. Right? And there's people that are actually starting to work on sort of rehabilitating the line. Right? And this is, you see articles here, even in Minnesota, they're talking about the deserted village making a comeback, right? And so they're talking about things like Gunflint City, right? And they're talking about what potentially could happen as a result of this. And so in the spring, there is, around the same time this is all happening, there's an excursion that's being basically run to the mine. So what they have to do is they basically have to go to North Lake, and they have to jump on canoes, and they have to canoe all the way across to the end of Gunflint, and then hike from the end of Gunflint into the mine, right? And again, you gotta imagine, you got all these guys coming up from Chicago, right? Like, these guys are not probably people that would be tromping through the woods doing this, right? And so they talk about there's been some drilling work that's being done, right? And this is the part where I got kind of cut off when COVID kind of hit, because I was trying to dig a little bit more into this company, because the Palatine company was actually incorporated in Arizona. And I remember right before, this is like literally March of 2020, I remember I had written I sent an email, I don't remember what I did. Anyway, I contacted somebody in the Secretary of State's office, and I'm looking for, and they're like, well, we can't find anything, right? And I was trying to, and then the pandemic hit and it all kind of veered off, right? But anyway, so this company was created as like a Polish cooperative for the Polish community in Chicago. And so they did actually, it was quite a, it wasn't like some sort of shady operation. They had some buildings, they had a lot of assets. These were pretty well-to-do guys in Chicago, right? Like, it wasn't, again, sort of some fly-by-night sort of operation. I found that, this was an image I took off eBay that I found. But here's the incorporation for the Palatine Mining Development Company. And so here's the ownership group for them. All right, we managed to track down some pictures of them. Believe it or not, that's mine. Years ago, when I started digging into this years ago, I'm like, hey, I have something from that, right? Because I think it was something on Gunflint I found on eBay, and it was like one of those things where I picked up for a couple bucks. It's actually one of their stock certificates, right? So basically, whoever this guy is, Stanislaw Kezidor, basically has purchased, he purchased 2,000 or 3,000 tons of iron ore. This one, because as you're going to see from the map, they were working at the Paulson mine, but they were also working by Tucker Lake as well. And so you can see it's dated the 12th day of July, 1921. And so this is actually from a Polish newspaper, right? And it basically shows the railway line. It shows the lands that they own, and then lands that they've leased. And here you can see the land over here by, I'm guessing Tucker Lake, the Tucker mine, right? And it talks about, the 250 million tons of ore that they have, and that, they're going to be shipping, 50 million tons almost immediately. Right? And so there's all this work that's done, there's all this talk about things that are happening, right? And, right? It's all in the newspapers, right? The Toronto Globe, okay, which today is the Globe and Mail, right? There's all this talk, and then, poof, everything just disappears, right? And I think in Raph's book, I think he makes the suggestion that after that May trip, where they went to North Lake and they canoed in and then they walked to the mine, I think that was we're done. moment, right? Because it basically says, so this article is from, it's a Canadian document, and it basically says that nothing's happened, right? Like there was all this work that was done, and they just poof, walked away from it. Right, and it talks about how I found this one, and it says by December they're looking at stuff in the U.S. South, right? Like they just totally moved on. They've forgotten about northern Minnesota, and they've moved on. So perfect. We are at the 1 hour mark, so that's my time limit. All right, self-imposed time limit. So again, if you haven't had an opportunity, if you've never looked at Willis Raff's book, there's a lot of things in there that I've talked about again. Certainly Dr. Raff didn't have the benefit of some of the more modern research that's turned up some things, but certainly if you really want to learn more about the history of the area and some of the things that we took a look at, it's a worthwhile look. Again, if you haven't been on any of the trails and looked at any of the sites, it's something worth looking at. Again, try to leave. And I'm not saying anybody in the room would do this, but we try to leave everything as it is, right? I've noticed myself, especially at that second mine site, the one on Ackley Lake Mine Lake, there was a lot of stuff that just disappeared, right? Like I remember I was there, so my little personal story. So I came in 1998. I came and I stayed at the Gunflint Pines, pitched a tent because I was a poor student, just starting I was a student anymore. I just started teaching, so I didn't have a lot of money, pitched my tent at the Gunflint Pines, and I remember I walked the railway line, and there was no Centennial Trail. The Keck was there, and I went to Gunflint City, and I went to all the mine sites, and I can remember seeing what I saw, and then going back years later, and I'm like, there's more stuff here. Stuff has vanished, right? I do have cards up here if you want to grab one later. I'm going to take questions momentarily. Just as a little bit of an update, I did mention that I do have a project sort of on the go. Actually, I have 3 on the go, one of which involves this area. So I am currently working on a book. I am trying to finish it off on this area. And so the book involves the logging operation that happened at the east end of Gunflint Lake. And it's something I've been working on for 10 years, so I started this project back in 2014. And the book is almost all done. There's basically 2 things that are left to do, some research in Toronto, and there's some archaeological work that needs to be done at a site here. And I was supposed to, I came down and stayed with John and Rose back in the fall of 2019. We were supposed to go, I was supposed to meet up with archaeologists from Superior National Forest and supposed to look at the site. I don't know if anybody remembers the first weekend in October in 2019, there was about a foot of snow that fell. And so that was a wash, and we're like, we'll come back in the springtime, and took care of it. Well, the border was closed for, 2.5 years? And so finally, we're supposed to do things. I've been going back and forth with Lee Johnson and Sarah Kerfoot, who's the new archaeologist for this area. We were supposed to come in the spring. Sarah tore her ACL. And so we're hoping now, it's almost like a curse, right? We're hoping now to get here in the beginning of October. Hopefully it doesn't snow. And actually get this archaeological work, and so I can finish this book. I know Michael's at the back, and I know the Historical Society is anxious for me to get this book done. But when that's done, I'm sure Bonnie will want me to come back down and talk a little bit about it and publicize this research. It is a really interesting piece of history, much like the Gunflint Mine is. So again, if you want to visit some of my sites, I do have cards here as well, as you can grab a card. I want to thank Bonnie and the folks here at Chickawauk, the Gunflint Trail Historical Society, for inviting me once again. It's always a pleasure to come back down here. Like I said, lots of familiar faces and lots of friends to catch up with down here. And I don't know if there's any questions.
So I'm a geologist. So one of the mysteries in all of this is the siting of the Paulson Mine. So if we go to your hometown in Thunder Bay, and we go hang around sort of downtown Eastish, a couple of nice parks, the same rocks are exposed there,
Yeah.
in the iron formation. They are less metamorphosed, more iron oxide rich. And those rocks go all the way to the Gunflint Narrows, give or take. And then there's a change for tectonic reasons. And so when I walk around and look at these rocks, the least likely ore-rich body in the Gunflint Iron Formation is what they mined at that time. So what you could have done is you could have mined the ore in downtown Thunder Bay. Third slide, the Gunflint Range, as you
Yeah.
all of that is beautiful iron ore, and the iron minerals are iron oxide, same as the Wasabi Range and the Cayuna Range. So why in the hell would you believe whoever did the geology out here, which is Winchell and Grant,
Yeah.
but the iron minerals are iron silicates. And so that little chunk you have up there is a huge energy waste,
Yeah.
a little scrap of ore, when you could have had a huge open pit line from basically the Gunflint Narrows all the way to east of Thunder Bay. It makes no sense.
So the one part of the story I didn't talk about, that's not talked about a lot, is that concurrent with the Paulson mine, and it's weird because the guy almost has the exact same name, his name is Richard Paulson, was trying to get a mine opened on the Canadian side of Gunflint. And this is all sort of happening concurrently, right? And it was one of, as far as I know, again, I mean, I don't have any expertise in geology. I took one geology class, didn't know what I was looking at with the rocks. But as far as I know, it was one of the reasons why I doomed the Paulson mine was that, you know, the same time the Paulson mine, they were trying to open it, you have, as you mentioned, rock that is not particularly profitable, is not high grade ore, right? And then all of a sudden, at the same time, they're opening up the Wasabi Range, where you have all of this nice soft hematite that you're just scooping up and dumping in a car, and they're like, well, that's a lot easier than digging a hole in the ground and trying to, you know, tunnel and shaft mine all of this ore that has to be extensively refined to get, you know, the iron. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Paulson mine just never caught on, right? Is like I said, you probably have a lot more expertise than I do.
So on the Gunflint Range equivalent, there is none of this direct shipping ore, which is it's a leachate concentrate. So it's like scooping sand, but it's 65% total iron. It's a moneymaker. And then on the Wasabi Range, you ran out of that eventually, and then you had to mine the actual rock.
Yeah.
And the iron formation, that's the taconite process. It's much more energy and money intensive.
Yeah.
You're still making money. But up here, you didn't have the direct shipping ore. And then again, superimposed on that, you have the rocks that they mined at the Paulson mine, which it's a tectonite, it's a metamorphic rock, and it's all iron silicates. You're never going to make a nickel.
Yeah.
It's as far away from anywhere as you could possibly get.
I think part of it was that there was this belief that it was almost like, you know, that the boom was just going to continue, right? Like, we're just going to try to get our hands on as much iron as we can, right? So, like, if I don't have it in this slideshow, but I know there's another one that basically shows all the iron ranges of the area, right? So it shows the Wasabi and the Gunflint and the Cayuna and the Gajibik and the Menominee, right? It shows all in the area, right? You know, so I think it was just this mad rush to open up as many iron deposits as possible, right? Because we're just, it's a moneymaker, right?
The thing I learned from you was that the rail line was supposed to go from Paulson to Ely.
Yeah.
You know, so it's the Sudan deposit there, which is a completely different thing geologically, but that's again 60-70% total iron. So it's like, yeah, we must find something on the way there. Let's connect that.
Well, that was the issue, because when they did the survey in 1888, they're like, that's why Duluth and Iron Range didn't build it, because there's nothing in here. Because usually in a lot of areas you find profitable timber. It's very desolate Canadian Shield, swamp and rock terrain, right? Like, you know, I've never been through the area between here and Ely, but maybe some of you have. It's not the best area to build it, right? It's probably, if this area was bad building, it's probably 10 times worse, right? Like, I know Duluth and Iron Range did another survey in the late 1890s, and I think they estimated the cost of building that 40 miles in the millions of dollars at the time, right? Which was an exorbitant amount of money. Any other questions?
Did this fail because of the climate, where the depression type thing that you mentioned, or was it just mainly your?
Sorry.
did this endeavor fail because of the downturn in the
Okay.
economy?
Okay, no. I think it's a combination of what we talked about, right? You have this economic depression that's happening. You have a very difficult ore to mine. Like I said, you have the Mesaba range at the time, right? That stuff's all gone now, but they were literally just picking up with a shovel and dumping it into a cart. You can't compete with that, right? Like the quality and the ease of mining that is like, I don't even remember if I have to look it up, but I can't even remember what happened to the price of iron. Like the price of everything tanked, right? So if the price is super low, well, it's a mine like the Paulson mine is going to be super unprofitable to mine, right? The value of iron is going to be very high to mine it, right? And so if they barely can make the Mesaba range, the Mesabi range go where you're just scooping it up, right? The Paulson range is just going to be, like I said, it's not going to be worth it, right? And again, these guys lost all the money, right? They kind of had a little bit of a shady operation kind of going on there. Any other questions? So if there's no further questions, again, you just want to take a picture of that. I have cards up here. You want to grab a card. Don't be afraid to send me an email. I don't know everything. I'm glad to have some of the geological information because there's only so many hats that you can wear, right? You got to be a historian, a business person,